Okay, in this video, we are going to focus on evaluating consensus Gentium arguments. Arguments like joiners. Recall that joiner's argument really boils down to this. People don't think that cereal is soup, so it's not. Premise, conclusion. We could add a most here. It's natural to say something like, nobody thinks cereal is soup. And what we mean is like, most people don't think cereal is soup, so it's not. This is an appeal to what most people think. There's a consensus, widespread agreement about something, that cereal isn't soup. We draw a conclusion, and our only reason given is about what most people think. Our only reason for drawing this conclusion is that there is a consensus. Our task is to evaluate arguments that have this kind of structure, and then ultimately evaluate joiner's argument. So our subtask is to apply Kelly's view. That is Thomas Kelly. His last name is also a first name. I'm not just friends with Kelly. Apply Kelly's view about when consensus is a legitimate piece of evidence to joiner's argument specifically. And in order to do that, to achieve both of these tasks, here's what you're going to need to be able to do. You're going to need to understand Kelly's argument. And the actual paper is a bit tough. I think that working together to read it in perusal, plus I've identified some of the key components, should help us to understand it, but it's not the easiest paper. So we're definitely going to review the essentials of Kelly's argument and apply it to some examples in this lecture. So we definitely need to understand Kelly's argument, and we need to understand it in enough depth so that you could clearly explain it yourself and apply it to new examples, and then also be able to apply it to joiner's argument. To do all that, you're going to need to be able to apply concepts, definitions, theories, views to concrete cases or case studies. Like, this is a general skill, being able to take a concept and say exactly how it applies to a concrete case. This is useful to do when we care about the actual case in question. And it's also useful to do if we want to better understand or demonstrate our understanding in the context of an assignment, the concept or definition or view itself. In this case, what we'll be applying is a view about when consensus is a legit piece of evidence for something. We're going to apply that view to a concrete case. In this case, that concrete thing is a concrete argument, a specific example of appealing to consensus as a reason to believe something. And in order to understand and apply Kelly's argument, we're also going to need to be able to identify and talk about some common patterns of reasoning and evaluate them as valid versus invalid, but still strong or good in some way, and weak. So we should be able to identify certain patterns of reasoning, especially consensus Gentium style patterns of reasoning. And we'll also need to be able to understand and identify inferences to the best explanation, because Kelly's view is that when appealing to consensus is legitimate, takes the form of an inference to the best explanation. And finally, this will all require understanding some basic definitions of argumentation, things you have been practicing already, but maybe we haven't practiced the jargon quite as much, like what it means to say that an argument is valid versus sound, or valid versus strong. So in this lecture, we're going to cover this stuff so that you can do this and ultimately do this in the context of your next paper. Okay, let's start with this skill. Applying concepts or definitions or theories or views, where this time we're ultimately going to talk about applying a view to a concrete case. I want to start by introducing a new concept for our course, one that we're going to revisit later after we write paper 1B. This will come up again, but let's introduce one now in order to illustrate how to write an application argument. Okay, maybe you've heard of cognitive biases, and specifically confirmation bias. What is confirmation bias? Confirmation bias is the tendency to evaluate new information or evidence and let's be more general. Instead of saying how we evaluate new information or evidence, let's say engage with. Because we can engage with information in lots of ways and not just evaluate it as good or bad. So the tendency to engage with new information or evidence in ways that really can only confirm what you already believe. Let's call what you already believe a pre-existing belief. It doesn't really matter which thing we choose. But here's a good brief definition of confirmation bias. What are some ways that we can engage with information so as to confirm what we already believe? We can search for it. So for example, if I already believe or suspect that something is true, I might go to Google and just search, what is the evidence that X is true? And then not search for reasons to think it's false. So I selectively look for something that would show that it's true. Or let's say that the information or evidence is ambiguous. I could selectively interpret it so that it supports what I already believe. For example, some common information that's ambiguous that we deal with every day is the meaning of a text message or what the other person's mood or intentions are. So if somebody says, okay, period, okay, period, that sounds like that person's frustrated or something, right? There's a way to interpret that piece of information so that the new information is that this person is angry or frustrated, but there are other interpretations available. And if you already believe that this person is frustrated or tends to be frustrated a lot or is mad at you, and then you get a text message that says, okay, period, you might selectively interpret that new piece of information as another example of this person being frustrated with you. But that's not the only interpretation. Okay, so that's an example where we selectively interpret. We can also selectively just notice and remember things. Right? So if you hold some stereotype or believe some stereotype about a group, maybe you'll only selectively even notice the people who fit the stereotype or the events that fit the stereotype and not even notice the ones that don't, and then log those away. As a simple example of this, the first time that I got glasses and had to pick out a pair for myself, suddenly I was noticing everyone else's glasses where I'd never even noticed them before. So they're just noticing a thing. That's not exactly a case of confirmation bias, but just our pre-existing beliefs can affect what we even notice or remember. And so again, we'll end up with a selective engagement with evidence that really can only confirm what we already believe, even if what we happen to believe is false. We'll end up confirming it by engaging with evidence in this particular kind of way. And then last but not least, we can evaluate it. For example, let's say you have two competing pieces of evidence, one that counts in favor of something you already believe and something that counts against it. And you could interpret the thing that counts in favor of it as the better piece of evidence. And maybe it is, but if your pre-existing belief is the reason for thinking that that's the better piece of evidence, that gets things the wrong way around, right? The evidence should be a guide to what to believe in, not vice versa. And so these are ways of engaging with new information or evidence where we really can't help but to confirm what we already believe. Why call that a bias? Importantly, this serves a function. Engaging in this kind of thinking, we all do it all the time. So surely there is some practical reason for engaging in this way of thinking. What would it be like to navigate your day constantly looking for how you could be wrong about every little detail? Functionally or practically, we don't want to engage in that kind of thinking all the time about everything. But when it matters, when we're trying to get stuff right, when we're looking for, what should we believe? What's true? If we only engage with new information or evidence in ways that can't help but to confirm what we already believe, we won't find out when we're wrong, right? So call it a bias for that reason. We have this tendency to do something that's a kind of deviation from the ideal way to do it if what you care about is getting to the truth. Okay, point. We've got a concept now, and I want you to be able to apply a concept to a concrete case. So let's give a case. Okay, imagine a classmate named Sophia, who unfortunately suspects her classmates don't really like her. And now imagine that Sophia is near the library on campus and sees her classmate Selma, say. She waves to Selma, but Selma doesn't wave back. Gee, I am not typing well today. And then on the basis of this event, Sophia concludes, see, my classmates don't like me. That Selma's avoiding her, pretending she doesn't see her. Okay, so here's a case where somebody is making sense of new information and drawing a conclusion. So question, could Sophia's thinking be affected by confirmation bias? And of course, we really don't know for sure what is going on in Sophia's head, especially since this is a made-up case and there's no Sophia with nothing going on in her head. But like, imagine someone like Sophia, and these are some facts about this person. Still, we don't know what's going on in their head. But given some of the details of the situation, is this something that could be affecting their thinking? Okay, so this is a kind of question you'll often get asked in a variety of classes in different fields. Why will you get asked this? Well, sometimes we care about the case. In this case, maybe you know Sophia and you're a friend of hers and you want to help her work through, her thought process here. Or maybe you are Sophia's therapist and you want to help Sophia work through the thought process. Or maybe you're interested in confirmation bias and you want to understand how it applies to concrete cases, or maybe your teacher is interested in your understanding of confirmation bias and wants to give you an opportunity to test it and demonstrate that level of understanding. So these are some reasons why we might engage in applying concepts to cases. So how should we write it up? I have a handy model for you that works for a lot of these kinds of questions. And I call it the claim, define, connect model. They don't need to be addressed in this order, they being the claim, define, and connect steps of your write-up. You don't need to address them in this order, but all three things should be in your write-up. So as an example here, I'll answer this question by making a claim. An answer to the question is my claim. I'm going to make sure I actually define the thing I'm applying. And if it's complex, maybe I need to explain it a bit. And then I'm going to connect specific details from the case study to the most important parts of the definition or the view or whatever it is I'm supposed to be applying. So let's ask that question first before we do our write-up. What are the most important parts of confirmation bias? One, it involves engaging with new information. Two, it involves a pre-existing belief. And three, the way of engaging with new information confirms the pre-existing belief. And these are the specific ways that you could engage with new information, and those might be worth identifying. So you need to identify the specific features of this case that demonstrate someone's got a pre-existing belief, someone's engaging with new information, and they're doing it in a way that can really only confirm what they already believe. So what is their pre-existing belief to prove that they do indeed have one? What is the new piece of information that they're engaging with? And how are they engaging with it so that it confirms what they already believe? That's what you need to establish by connecting with specific details from the case. So here's how I would write this up. Feel free to pause and write up your own answer and compare it with mine. But I would say, yes, Sophia's, I'm just going to call her S, thinking could be a product of confirmation bias. And I'm just going to copy this. Confirmation bias is the tendency to engage with new info or evidence, searching for it, interpreting it, noticing and remembering it, evaluating it in ways that confirm a pre-existing belief. In this case, this is often a natural transition from stating the thing you're applying to the case you're applying it to. In this case, now we need to identify the features, right? So what's the pre-existing belief? In this case, Sophia, we could just write has a pre-existing belief, but that's kind of a natural thing to say. Sophia already believes that her classmates don't really like her. And maybe in parentheses, identify the part, see, pre-existing belief that connects to the specific wording of the definition. That's often useful to do. If there are keywords, use those keywords because it better highlights the connection between the case and the definition or the theory or whatever you're applying. So in this case, Sophia already believes that her classmates don't really like her. That's a pre-existing belief. And she interprets an encounter as a new piece of evidence for her belief that people don't really like her. And we could go further and now supporting this, right? Well, why think that? What from the case leads you to believe that she interprets? And we could really nail it down that she's confirming what she already believes by highlighting that she selectively interprets an encounter as a new piece of evidence. Well, now we're referring to something and we're saying we've got things we need to clarify or support. What's the encounter? I know the case is here, but when you write stuff up, don't assume people read the thing you're referring to. Usually saying what that is helps you to clearly spell out your thinking and not just provide the reader with, like, don't make the reader go back and look for it, even if they are familiar with it. And maybe a reader isn't already familiar with it. So I recommend just getting in the habit of, saying what the encounter was, saying what she's interpreting. Okay, so what should we say here? And she selectively interprets an encounter as a new piece of evidence. When Selma doesn't wave back, she interprets this as Selma avoiding her, acting like she doesn't like her. When there are plausible alternative interpretations of Selma's behavior. For example, maybe Selma didn't see her. Or maybe Selma is self-conscious and thinks no one likes her and was like shy and did that thing where you pretend you don't see someone because you're awkward and you don't know what to do. It doesn't matter which thing, right? We don't know what's going on with Selma. We're just human beings who know how social situations and other people act well enough that we could come up with plausible alternative interpretations of the behavior that are plausible enough Selma doesn't, or Sophia doesn't need to necessarily draw this particular conclusion. Okay, I am not saying this is the most beautiful paragraph. You might even have gone further in like restating the like what happened when, in the case, but this has all the pieces. You've made a clear claim about the case. Yes, this could be a case of confirmation bias. We said what it was, and then we connected specific details of the case to the most important parts of the definition. She's got a pre-existing belief, she's engaging with new evidence, and she's doing it in a way that can only confirm what she already believes. We might even be able to go further in highlighting some of this stuff. So she selectively interprets an encounter. I kind of did use this word, a new piece of evidence. And I said selectively interprets, but I never said she can't help but to confirm, right? And maybe I could add that to the list, right? So she selectively interprets an encounter as a new piece of evidence for her belief. For example, like when blah, blah, blah. In doing so, Sophia can't help but to confirm what she already believes. Something like that could get that other bit in. Again, I'm not saying this is the most beautifully written. I'm saying it has the most important pieces. Now, sometimes the thing you're supposed to apply is more complicated than this. This is actually not that simple of a concept, but it's fairly straightforward, and it's fairly straightforward how to apply it to cases. And so I call this the claim define. Just say what the concept is, and then this is the part where you usually have to go a little bit further, not just identifying which parts of the case connect to the definition, but sometimes you have to provide support for the claim that they do. For example, nothing in the actual statement of the case says she is selectively interpreting information. You have to support the claim that she's selectively interpreting the information by noting that there are other alternatives of Selma's behavior. So you have to support this part. When things get more complex, this part will get more complex, but also so will this one. Maybe you also need to explain it. If it's not just like a here's what it is, and then the reader will fully understand the thing you're talking about. Maybe you need to explain it. So if Kelly's view is the thing that we are applying, maybe you need to state it and then explain it a bit. Maybe illustrate it with an example before it even makes sense to apply it to a brand new case and argue for how it applies in that new case. But this is the basic model that should serve you well in lots of questions like this. Okay, next, let's turn to some common patterns of reasoning, good and bad. And let's start with the good, and we'll get clear on what exactly we mean by good in a moment. Let's start with examples of valid patterns of reasoning, or sometimes these are called argument forms. And I'm going to give them names, but you don't need to memorize the names. You're not going to be tested on it or anything. But here is a really simple one that you're definitely familiar with. Let's say I reason A or B, not A. Therefore, what follows from this? B, right? I have a cat or a dog. I don't have a cat. Thus, it follows I have a dog, right? And 5-year-olds can do this. I've seen 5-year-olds do this. So it's one or the other. It's not the one thing, so it has to be the other. This is a pattern of reasoning. There are premises, and if these two premises are true, this has to be true. This is a valid pattern of reasoning. What is our definition of validity? And there's two ways to put it. They're equivalent, but there's two ways to put it. One, if, emphasis on that word if, the premises are true. And I don't mean like just one of them, I mean all of them, however many there are, whether there's 2 or 20. If the premises are true, then the conclusion must, emphasis on that strong word, must be true. It's not enough that the premises and conclusion all happen to be true. It matters that if the premises are true, the conclusion has to be true. And so here's an alternative way to put it. It's impossible for the premises to all be true and the conclusion false. So in this case, if these premises are true, this has to be true. There's no way that it's definitely one or the other. It's not the one, and it's also not the other. If these are true, this has to be true. And that's what we mean by valid. Now, when it comes to evaluating arguments, validity is just about the inference, the move from the premises to the conclusion. It's not about the quality of the argument overall. And that should be especially clear when we have something like this sort of schema for an argument, because we don't even know what A and B are, right? I have a cat or a dog. I don't have a dog, therefore I have a cat. Well, if that's about me, then those premises are actually true and the conclusion's true. In that case, it's a sound argument. The premises are actually true and they guarantee that the conclusion is. But there might be cases where we have a valid argument and the premises aren't true. For example, I have a cat or a dog. I don't have a cat, therefore I do have a dog. In that case, it's false because I do have a cat and I don't have a dog. But the pattern of reasoning is still good. The inference from the premises to the conclusion is still valid, but the argument isn't good overall because that version had a false premise. And that's how I ended up with a false conclusion, even though I gave a valid argument. So validity is really just about what follows from the premises if they're true. We, of course, also care about whether the premises are actually true. We need both parts. Okay, so those are two definitions of validity. So let's look at a few more valid patterns of reasoning. Maybe let's move the definition up here to the top. Okay, so let's get a few more on the table. So here's another really common one, especially in philosophical arguments, and you'll definitely see this pattern of reasoning coming up soon. If A, then B, A, thus B. This pattern is common enough that it gets a special name. The special name comes from Aristotle. Don't worry, it's obviously a weird name that's going to be hard to remember, so don't worry about remembering it. Just notice that the pattern is clearly a good one, right? If A, then B, A, therefore B. And let's give a concrete example. Just pick any statement at all and plug it into A, and then any other statement and plug it into B, and you've got yourself a valid argument. Doesn't matter whether you pick true or false statements, as long as you consistently plug them in exactly as this pattern says. So what's a statement? Any statement at all. How about the Golden Gate Bridge is in San Diego? And how about let B mean, let's see, or let's just pick any other statement. Okay, I wanted to pick one that was true and one that's false. All right, so this one is false. This one's actually true because it's in San Francisco, which is in California. Okay, so if I plug these into this pattern here, so I'm going to copy and paste it, and let's say I pick this one to be A. So I'm going to plug this in for both of these spots, A. If the Golden Gate Bridge is in, and SD stands for San Diego, I'm just being lazy, and the Golden Gate Bridge is in San Diego. And then let's grab this one. What do we think of the argument? If the Golden Gate Bridge is in San Diego, then the Golden Gate Bridge is in California. That's a pretty robotic way of saying it. We can shorten it and mean exactly the same thing. The Golden Gate Bridge, is in California, and the Golden Gate Bridge is in San Diego. Therefore, the Golden Gate Bridge is in California. Is that a valid argument? Yes, even though it has a false premise. This one's actually true, right? Like if something's in California, then that thing, if something is in San Diego, then that thing is in California, whatever it is, including the Golden Gate Bridge. That seems true. This one's clearly false. And we've got a true conclusion. And so it's a valid argument because if the premises are true, the conclusion has to be true. But it's not a good argument overall because it has a false premise. Notice it's got a true conclusion. That doesn't mean it's a good argument. If you give a stupid argument for a conclusion that happens to be true, that doesn't mean the argument you gave is good. It means you got lucky. Even if that argument's valid, right? The problem is it has a clearly false premise. So validity is only half the battle. This is something that is valid, but not good overall. Now, we said we were going to look at patterns good and bad. Let's highlight a bad pattern. Did I write good up here? Yeah, good. So let's look at bad. And by bad, I mean it's invalid, it's not valid, but also it could easily be confused with a valid argument. And there's like nothing to recommend. I'll say why I want to be clear. Like being invalid isn't necessarily mean an argument is bad overall, but some arguments are invalid but get confused with valid arguments and they're actually completely bad. All right, so here's one that looks like modus ponens. If A, then B, B, thus A. And it doesn't matter which punctuation I use here. I'm just trying to be consistent. That's why I changed it. Okay, what about this one? It looks really similar here, but I switched the premise from A to B and I switched the conclusion likewise. And that changes a lot. Consider the following two arguments. If you are a citizen, if you were born in the US, then you are a citizen. Let's start by making this a case of modus ponens, the above, right? So what is A in this case? You were born in the US, and B is you are a citizen. So we'll make the next premise be A, you were born. And then what will follow? This part is B. And so we conclude that, right? Thus, you are a citizen. That looks good. At any rate, it's clearly a valid argument. If the premises are true, the conclusion has to be true. This might actually not be a true conditional. It's generally true, but maybe it's possible to lose citizenship somehow. Like maybe if you're a spy or something, you could lose your, I'm not sure how that works. But maybe it's not universally true. But if this is true, and if this is also true, then this clearly follows. So the inference is valid. Let's change it around though. So instead of doing the part that comes after the if, we do the part that comes after the then, as in the bad case. So let's take you are a citizen and change here. So I've changed it around. If you were born in the US, then you're a citizen. You are a citizen, thus you were born in the US. This is not a valid argument. It is possible that the premises are both true and yet the conclusion could be false. To evaluate validity, we don't care about what's actually true, just what's possible. So let's make up a scenario. If we can come up with any example of how someone could be a citizen while this is the rule and yet not have been born in the US, then that shows the argument's invalid. And since there are other paths to citizenship other than just being born in the US, it is possible that one is a citizen through one of those other routes. So imagine one is a naturalized citizen. In this case, the premise is true. The person is a citizen, but they weren't born in the US. They were born elsewhere and then became a citizen by becoming a naturalized citizen. In this case, the premises are true and the conclusion is false. And that is even possible shows that the argument is invalid. And if you confuse an argument like this with a valid one and think it's valid, you've made a kind of error. Right, so we've seen a concrete case of the bad one. This one gets a name too, but it's a little longer. It's called the fallacy of affirming the consequent, where the bit of a conditional that comes after a then is called the consequent. And this bit is called the antecedent. So this is the fallacy of affirming the consequent. This is a formal fallacy. Sometimes it's called a formal fallacy. Because anything that has this pattern is invalid and it can be mistaken for a valid pattern of reasoning. So there's an error in the reasoning here. So that's an example of a pattern that is bad. And we don't even need to know what A and B are to see that the conclusion doesn't follow from the premises. Okay. And let's look at one more that's valid. This one gets another name that also comes from Aristotle, but you don't need to memorize it. It's very similar looking to modus ponens. We'll start with the same premise one. If A, then B. This time, our next premise is not B. And the conclusion is not A. For example, if you were born in the US, then you're a citizen. You're not a citizen. Thus, it follows that you weren't born in the US, because if you were by premise one, you'd be a citizen, but you're not, so you couldn't have been. Okay, this is a valid pattern of reasoning. This pattern of reasoning is familiar in the context of science, right? If my hypothesis is true, then I would expect this to happen, but this didn't happen, thus my hypothesis is not true, or one of the assumptions I made in connecting my hypothesis to my prediction. Okay, so that's a valid pattern of reasoning. And then there is a similar looking invalid pattern of reasoning, which goes if A, then B. Above, we negated the second part, the consequent. and concluded the negation of the first part, the antecedent. Now we're going to do the opposite. If not A, then it follows not B. I'm not going to go into this in much detail. You could probably come up with cases that are pretty clear. Like, well, I guess we may as well do it. If you were born in the US, then you are a citizen. You weren't born in the US, thus you're not a citizen. That doesn't follow, because again, you could have been a naturalized citizen, in which case the premises would be true and the conclusion would be false. So this one also gets a kind of longer name. It's called the fallacy of denying the antecedent, but you don't need to remember that. The point is, anything that has these patterns is invalid, and if you confuse it with a valid pattern of reasoning, you think that the premise is supposed to follow from the conclusion, and like it does, then you've made an error. Okay, so those are some patterns of reasoning that are valid. If the premises are true, you're guaranteed a true conclusion. That guarantee is important for the definition validity. Now, there are some, let's call them technically invalid, even though they're just straight up invalid. There are some technically invalid patterns of reasoning that are perfectly good arguments. And really, most of the patterns of reasoning we use in science are not valid patterns of reasoning, like this one, but instead are technically invalid, as in the premises don't guarantee the conclusion, but are still good in that the premises make it more likely that the conclusion is true. We don't always get a guarantee. That doesn't mean the argument is bad. It just means you haven't met this higher standard of getting a guarantee. But there are lots of domains in which that's really difficult and perhaps can't be met, which is an interesting, deeper philosophical question. And if you're interested in that question, take philosophy of science next. Okay, so let's give an example that we're going to look at later in this lecture, and that is relevant to the text we are currently reading, and that is inference to the best explanation. This time, instead of starting with a pattern, I'm going to start with a concrete example of an argument that is based on my own personal experience. So let's say I have some observations, and I'm just going to list them. Here are the facts. My laptop is gone. It's not where I left it. It was on my desk. Now it's not. My window is open. And the screen is missing. I didn't leave it open, but what I see now is my window is open and the screen is missing. I look around and all of the drawers in anything that has drawers in my apartment are ajar. What conclusion do you draw? I drew the conclusion that I was robbed, and I was correct. So is this a valid pattern of reasoning? Is this a valid argument? Forget the pattern part. Just, is this a valid argument? In order to be a valid argument, we have to be able to say, if the premises are true, the conclusion has to be true. It's impossible that these premises could be true and this conclusion false. But clearly it's not impossible. Can you come up with an example that shows that? Call that a counterexample. Can you come up with a counterexample in which we get exactly these three observations, but I have not been robbed? Maybe I'm being punked, right? My laptop isn't really gone. It's just out of sight. My window's open, the doors are ajar, but I have not been robbed. I've just been punked. Or maybe like I have a roommate who's kind of off kilter and does something real strange, but my laptop isn't gone. These other things, I haven't been robbed. Maybe aliens came. That one's a little more far-fetched, but like it's still consistent with my premises. Maybe aliens came and just made things temporarily invisible and opened my door and my drawers are ajar. That's a scenario in which I have these observations, but I haven't been robbed. It's a weird one, but it's possible. It's possible. It's not ruled out. And that is the sense in which this is not a valid argument. We often hear the word valid and we think good. If you say it's invalid, you're saying it's bad completely. No, validity is one part of evaluating an argument, and it's only one standard we could hold an argument to. That's a really high standard to expect a guarantee. If the premises are true, the conclusion is guaranteed to be true. So a slightly less demanding standard is that if the premises are true, the conclusion is highly likely. And that's what's happening here. And indeed, these premises really all were true. We can add an implicit premise here, right? These are the ones that specifically maybe went through my mind. But here's an implicit premise that would make sense to add, that we're all kind of assuming when we evaluate whether or not it's likely given this information that I've been robbed. The best explanation for my observations is that I was robbed. So that's what we're assuming when we're evaluating this. Now, even adding this in as an explicit premise, the argument is not valid. It's possible that these are the observations and that this is indeed the very best explanation for my observations, and yet I wasn't robbed. Maybe one of those other weird explanations is actually true. And then, of course, there's also an interesting question: what makes an explanation a good one? But we'll set that aside. Notice we could turn this into a valid argument by adding this premise: the best explanation is always true. Now, if I say, here are my observations, blah, 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 the best explanation is X, and the best explanation is always true, then whatever X is has to be true. I've now turned this into a valid argument by adding another premise, except that premise is clearly false. The best explanation isn't always true. It's just the most likely one. So I'm not going to add an obviously false premise to my argument. That would just make it valid but unsound, valid but has a false premise. So by taking that premise out, my argument isn't valid anymore. It's merely strong, but at least all the premises are true. And overall, this is a very good argument, right? Okay, so here's another good argument, just not valid, strong. What is the pattern? Let's generalize from this to a pattern like we had with the other ones. And the pattern goes something like this. This time, instead of listing the observations, I'm just going to put it like this: observations, whatever they are. There are some observations. And then we've got the claim that the best plus X. And we could add X as true, but that is probably unnecessary. That's what we mean when we say X. Okay. So that is a pattern of reasoning. Identify some observations, make the claim that the best explanation is X, and then conclude X. Arguments that have this pattern of reasoning are not valid. They're never valid. They're never valid, but all that means is you never get a guarantee that X is actually true. But they're good, they're strong. And if the premises are actually true as well, then the argument is overall good. And a piece of jargon we often use for this when we're not talking about validity, but strength, as we'll call it, cogent. But you don't need to do this at all. All you need to say is, this is a good argument. The premises don't guarantee the conclusion, but they make it likely. If the premises are true, the conclusion is likely to be true, at least better than chance, or more likely than, right? So the conclusion is likely to be true. Not guaranteed, but likely. And if the premises are actually true, then it is overall a good argument. Let's change how I worded that to start off with. This is a good inference. The move from premises, drawing a conclusion on the basis of these premises, is a good inference. And if the premises are actually true, then it is overall a good argument, even though you don't get a guarantee, even though it's not quote unquote valid. So that's another pattern of reasoning. Okay, and so let's call this, we called above good, valid patterns. Here's good, not valid, but good. Strong is usually the piece of jargon used here. The inference is strong. So here's a nice pattern. Now, why did we highlight this one? Because in his article, Kelly argues that when appealing to consensus is legit, it's because we can set it up as an inference to the best explanation. So let's turn to understanding and applying Kelly's view. Okay, so one thing that's worth highlighting, and I think I've said this elsewhere, is that the main claim in a paper, including Kelly's, including all the papers that you will write for this class, the main claim in an argumentative paper is an answer to a question. It's an answer to a question that doesn't have an obvious answer, where there's room for interesting disagreement, such that the paper needs writing. And it's useful to identify the question that the writer is asking as a way of framing their answer or their claim, right? And so the broader question here is, when is it legit? Sorry, let me rephrase this. When is consensus a legitimate piece of evidence for the truth of something? And we're not asking the question like, when is it practical to go along with what everyone believes, right? If everyone believes the earth goes, or sorry, that the sun goes around the earth for deep religious reasons and are going to persecute anyone who says otherwise, well, maybe you've got a strong practical reason to accept the consensus on this one, or else be confined to house arrest or persecuted in some other way. That's a practical reason to accept consensus. What we're interested in is, when is consensus a piece of evidence? When is it an epistemic reason? The word epistemic means has to do with knowledge and truth. Epistemology is the study of knowledge. If your goal is to figure out what's true, when is consensus relevant to that goal? When is it a piece of evidence? That's our question. And Kelly's answer is what? When is it a legitimate piece of evidence? He says, consensus is a legitimate piece of evidence for the truth of whatever there's consensus about. When let me rephrase that. When the best explanation for the consensus, for the existence of the consensus, for the fact that everyone agrees about this, okay, that's the long answer. Let's start with concrete examples and then come back to this long answer. Here's a really simple example. Let's call this example, it's Tuesday. So sometimes I forget what day it is. Is it Tuesday or is it Thursday? I'll just blank on it. suddenly. So let's say this happens and I ask the class, today's Tuesday, right? And everyone is nodding their head like I'm an idiot, okay? So let's say I infer from the fact that everyone is nodding their head that everyone here now in this class, let's say there's like 25 people or 45 people or something like that, everyone, or at least nearly everyone, maybe not literally everyone, is nodding. Maybe my quick assessment is that almost everyone is nodding and some people just aren't paying attention. Everyone believes that it is Tuesday. Thus, it is Tuesday. This is my argument. Here, everyone refers to my class. And again, concessions have been made about everyone. Okay, so what is the thing that everyone believes? That's this. This means there's a consensus that it is Tuesday. Is this, the consensus that it's Tuesday, a reason to believe that in fact it is Tuesday? That seems plausible, right? That this is a case where everyone thinking something seems like a good reason to believe that the thing they all think is true. Kelly's answer is consensus, in this case, everyone thinks it's Tuesday, is a legitimate piece of evidence for the truth of whatever there's consensus about. It is, in fact, Tuesday. When the best explanation for the consensus, the explanation for everyone's thinking it's Tuesday, is that the thing there's consensus about is true, it is Tuesday, and people figured it out. As opposed to some other explanation, right? To say that this is the best explanation, we have to compare it with the other possible explanations that it is better than, if any, right? So what are some other explanations for how everyone could come to believe that it is Tuesday, even though it's not? And they're all kind of weird. Like, how would a whole class, especially, I just pulled them on the fly, so they haven't had time to interact or anything. Like, these people would have had to have independently come to believe it's Tuesday when it's not. How could that even happen? It could. If you're creative enough, you'll come up with an explanation for how that could happen. But whatever that explanation is, it's probably weird or unlikely. So the best explanation is that it's Tuesday and people know it. And we can also say, like, and people are good at figuring out what day it is. We all have phones on us. We have to make choices about where to go. Some people don't teach classes that are Tuesday, Thursday, and get Tuesday, Thursday specifically mixed up. Like, people are on to what day it is. And that's why the best explanation for the consensus is that it's Tuesday. And that is why this is evidence for it being Tuesday. Okay, so Kelly would say, let's write up a case analysis here. Let's apply Kelly's argument to this question. So let's say your writing prompt is something like this. Apply Kelly's view to the it's Tuesday argument. And maybe the prompt might even go further and say something like this. Is, according to Kelly or whatever, is the fact that there's consensus about what day it is a good reason to believe that it is whatever day there's consensus about, Tuesday or whatever? And recall the model, claim, answer the question. Maybe it's a strict yes or no, as it will be in this case. If it's a it depends, you can argue that too, right? Depends on the case. But in this case, there's a yes no answer. So what's your answer to the question? What is Kelly's view? And then support your answer by connecting the details of this case to the most important features of Kelly's view. Okay, so let's do it. I recommend you pause and write up your own little write-up, one short paragraph that applies Kelly's answer using the claim, define, connect model. Okay, let's do it together. Okay, yes. According to Kelly's argument, or view about when stuff is legit. According to Kelly's view, the fact that everyone believes it is Tuesday is a legitimate piece of evidence for what day it is. According to Kelly, and then you could write something like this. Like, this isn't the most beautiful way to phrase it, but for purposes here, good enough. According to Kelly, consensus is a legit piece of evidence for something. Let's kind of shorten it here. Consensus is a legitimate piece of evidence when the best explanation for the consensus is that the thing there's consensus about is true and people figured it out. And now, since I'm saying Kelly said something, and since I can point to where Kelly said that thing, I definitely need to provide a citation. I didn't quote him. I probably am saying something kind of close, but I haven't read Kelly in at least a week, and I'm not quoting him. Hopefully it's a paraphrase. If I'm writing this, carefully, I'm going to go back and check and make sure I've paraphrased adequately and haven't just changed one word. Otherwise, maybe I need to directly quote him if it's important to get at exactly what he said, if there really isn't a better way and every word matters, as sometimes is the case for principles and definitions. But I'm definitely going to put the page number right here. It's important we use citations even when we're not using direct quotations. We'll use signal phrasing to make it clear I'm introducing what someone else said. And then a page number kind of tells us where they said it, and also helps to put bookends on our reference to someone else's idea so that when I start writing again, it's clear I'm writing in my voice. According to Kelly, this is the thing he thinks. Page number, done citing Kelly, me again. Continuing on. Okay. So according to Kelly, the fact that everyone believes it's Tuesday is a legitimate piece of evidence for what day it is. According to Kelly, and who cares that I said it twice? We're not trying to write the most beautiful thing right now. We're trying to make an argument. Consensus is a legitimate piece of evidence when the best explanation for the consensus is that the thing there's consensus about is true and people figured it out. In this case, this is where you now have to connect details of the case to the most important parts of the argument. So what were the most important parts of the argument? You need to say what the best explanation for the consensus is. You need to support that claim too. So you need to argue that the best explanation is it's true and that people figured it out. And part of that will require thinking of other possible explanations for how people could come to believe this and be wrong, and say that those are unlikely. Okay, so that's the basic bit that needs to be said. And now we should support this ideally, right? So the best explanation is that it is Tuesday and everyone figured it out. Why think that's a good explanation? It is very easy to figure out what day it is. We all have mobile devices or whatever, and it's something we usually explicitly think about when organizing our day or our week. Now, context matters, right? So during the pandemic, when everyone was forced to stay at home, something that many people remarked on was how days seemed to run into one another with their schedules changed so completely. The usual things that mark which day it was were out the window. And in that context, if everyone agreed it was Tuesday, maybe that's the alternative explanation. Maybe everyone's lost track of what day it is, although in that case, you'd expect people to be all over the place and not unanimously agreeing that it's Tuesday. So the context matters, right? But generally, and especially now that we're not all forced to be at home anymore in the same way, It's very easy to figure out what day it is, and it's something people usually explicitly think about, especially if they're in a class that happens on a certain day at a certain time, right? As is the case in our example. So you could fill out some more of that stuff that would really fill out but this is like enough to at least get started. Here's a reason to think that's a good explanation. It's a plausible, likely one. And it is difficult to even come up with alternative explanations for how everyone could come to believe that it's Tuesday and be wrong. Maybe you could even come up with like the thing that seems the most plausible to you and argue that that's unlikely. That would be able to go a step forward. But this at least gives us some reason to think that this really is the best explanation. Here's why it's a good one, and here's why it doesn't seem like there's a better one. I can't even think of one as evidence there's not a better one. So of course, it's not foolproof. We don't get a guarantee here. Maybe you're just not creative enough, or maybe the unlikely thing really is what's true, as can happen. So we don't get a guarantee. The point is, this is just a piece of evidence to be weighed up with other evidence if you have it. Okay, so that would be a write-up. We have supported our answer by connecting details of the case to the most important parts of the theory. Okay, I'm going to ask you to apply Kelly's view to another case, but before we do, we need to generate it ourselves. So let's start with a quick test relevant to some stuff earlier in today's lecture. Does the conclusion here, oops, I didn't finish writing it in, follow from the premises? When I give this question to students, even after lecturing on validity, more than half of the class says yes. Now, is this a careful generalization? At the very least, most college students say yes, but that probably generalizes all right to most people. When the conclusion, or when given this question, most people say yes, more than 50%, sometimes much higher. Is that most people, so here's my new argument. Most people say or believe, there's a difference between what we say and what we believe. One is often a guide to the other, and one often produces the other, but let's just simplify it to most people believe that the conclusion follows from the premises. Thus, the conclusion follows from the premises. What do you think of this argument? So this argument is about this argument, right? It's just the belief in question happens to be about another argument. Is this a good argument? Is this consensus legitimate evidence for this conclusion? The correct answer about the case is that no, the conclusion doesn't follow from the premises, actually, and I can try to prove it to you. The correct answer is no. At least as I believe that it's no, and everything in a long history and tradition of teaching argumentation says no. Here's my proof. It's possible these premises are true and this conclusion is false. So imagine that all roses are flowers. There's lots of flowers in the world. Some of those flowers are indeed roses. And there's lots of red flowers, like tulips and others. but none of the roses are red. There's pink roses, yellow roses, white roses. So in this scenario, roses are flowers, but they just don't come in red. Other flowers do, not roses. And in this world, some roses aren't red. So it's possible the premises are true and yet the conclusion is false. These premises do not guarantee this conclusion. The conclusion does not follow from the premises. Should the fact that I ask students this every semester and more than half of them consistently say, yes, it does, should that give me pause in my thinking that it doesn't? And I say no, because I know students get this kind of question wrong, and there's even some ability to explain why. Like, I have some explanation for how lots of smart students, smart people, this has nothing to do with an intelligence test, lots of smart students, independently of one another, get to the wrong answer. Like, I've got a good explanation for how that happens, and it happens all the time. And so that's going to be relevant to my drawing the conclusion that, no, I don't take everyone's agreement that the answer is yes as something that gives me pause. What it does make me wonder is if people understand the question I'm asking. But even, let's just set that aside for now. Here's another case that I give students right after this one. Does the conclusion follow from these premises? When I give students this question, 90% or higher say no. Notice we've been talking about patterns of reasoning or argument forms. These two arguments share an underlying pattern of reasoning. They're both all A are B, some B are C, thus some A are C. And it turns out this is an invalid pattern of reasoning. The premises don't guarantee the conclusion. The correct answer is no again, and this time everyone gets it. So in both cases, because they're the same, the correct answer is no. People get the first one wrong and the second one right. Why is that? What's the explanation for how so many people independently come to the wrong answer in this one? One possible explanation is confirmation bias. One possible explanation is when we evaluate arguments, here is a new piece of information, it's an argument. We use our pre-existing beliefs, like this conclusion is true. I know some roses are red. And then you go, is this a good argument for that conclusion? Well, it's consistent with what I already know and believe. Checks out. So if you're using your pre-existing belief as a guide to evaluating an argument for that belief, that seems to fit the definition of confirmation bias. And people do have a tendency to selectively evaluate new information or evidence, in this case, evaluate an argument based on how it fits with their background beliefs instead of the other way around. And because I know that people have this tendency, and that in cases like this, where the argument has a true conclusion, but it's not a good argument for that true conclusion, but kind of looks like one, I expect that people are going to get this kind of thing wrong. Whereas this one doesn't fit with what we already believe, doesn't have a true conclusion, even though it's the same structure, people don't get this one wrong. Maybe a similar explanation that isn't clearly a case of confirmation bias, though it does seem pretty similar, is just the mere fact that the conclusion is true or false signals, like, do we need to stop and look? If we got to a conclusion that fits with what we already believe, we just don't even engage with the information. We don't. So maybe this is a case of like noticing or selectively noticing things. I'm not sure. But when something fits with what you already believe, you just kind of go like, everything checks out. I'm not going to stop and evaluate it. But when something doesn't fit with what you believe, that's a red flag, and you give it a closer look and figure out how this false thing came to be given the premises you were given. In any case, the important point here is I have a good explanation for how lots of smart people could get to the wrong answer. So let's call this argument right here the Rose's case, or the Rose argument case. And our question, like last time, I'm just going to go copy and paste it. It's going to be similar to this one. Okay, so apply Kelly's view to the Rose argument case. Is the fact that there's consensus about whether or not the conclusion follows from the premises evidence that the conclusion, well, let's put it the same way. Let's see, is the fact that there's consensus that the conclusion does not follow evidence that, like, indeed, the conclusion does not follow. So again, use the claim, define, connect model. And even though you've like defined it or explained Kelly's view in a previous, just do it again, make a complete answer. Pause and write it up on your own, and then turn the video back on and we'll do it together. Okay, let us do it together. So claim. Well, what is the claim in this case? Again, I picked one that should be yes or no, but in more complex cases, it might be, it depends on A, in which case one, or B, in which case another, and you have to kind of support your answer. But in this case, there should be a clear answer. And I say that the answer is no. I do not think consensus around this is good evidence to believe the conclusion. And I think Kelly's view gives a pretty good argument for why. So let's actually use some of the structure that will probably apply to any Kelly application answer. Okay, so according to Kelly's view, the fact that everyone believes blank is or is not a legitimate piece of evidence for whatever you put in that first blank will be the same. You could just put an X here instead. According to Kelly, consensus is blah, blah, blah. In this case, the best explanation for everyone believing is, and this is where you actually have to go beyond your knowledge of Kelly to think about the case and support it by coming up with possible explanations. And this is where, in many of the more interesting cases you might analyze, there's more interesting work to be done in room for disagreement just right here. But this would be a good template for writing Kelly case analyses. So let's fill it in for the Rose's argument. According to Kelly's view, the fact that everyone believes according to Kelly, blah, blah, blah. In this case, the best explanation for everyone believing is that people's people we don't know how people are really getting to the conclusions, treat the brain like a black box. I don't know how it outputs a belief, but plausibly. Or maybe that's not the right explanation entirely. Maybe it's because this is, I don't know, but it's certainly a kind of argument that lots of people get wrong, and there are different hypotheses about why that is. And here's one of them. And the point is that having a plausible explanation for how lots of people could be wrong, especially about something that's kind of confusing, undermines the evidential value of everyone's believing something. Right? So especially as the teacher in this case, where I know this is a tricky concept, and another thing that makes it tricky is that follows from is kind of vague, and even when I'm specific and I use the word valid and I give it a precise definition, we also use the word valid in our ordinary discourse in a different way. Valid just means good, like your feelings are so valid, right? That just means good. We use it all the time. And when you call something valid, it means like you're approvingly evaluating it as a whole. And if you say it's invalid, it's bad all around. And we're really just evaluating the inference. So there's lots of reasons to think that people are going to have a hard time with this concept. It's tricky. But it's well understood, and most people come to understand what's meant by it with some study, and it is useful for navigating our arguments and our, figuring out what to believe. So there's my answer. That's how Kelly's view applies in this case. So we've seen an example where we've applied Kelly's view to a case where consensus does seem like a legit piece of evidence, and a case where consensus does not seem like a legit piece of evidence. And I want to consider one more case, and this is the cool jacket case. Let's see, I think I've been doing cases in black. Okay, say we're in class and I'm giving you these arguments and we're talking about Kelly's view, and I ask you, do you guys think my new jacket is cool? And let's say everyone nods yes, or like most people are nodding yes, and some people aren't really paying attention. So like, what I conclude from this is that nodding represents what people think or believe. I'll just try to be consistent in what words I'm using, even though they're think and believe mean the same thing. Most people believe my jacket is cool. Thus, it is. What should I say about this case? One, let's just assume it's true. Everyone does believe my jacket is cool. Should I use the fact that everyone believes my jacket is cool as a reason to think it is? Well, we do like to consult other people to get a sense of what looks good, and we trust people's opinions. But in this case, like, I'm the teacher, and this is a context where I kind of put people on the spot and ask them about my jacket. And so maybe they and they aren't just being nice, they do sort of nod and go like, oh yeah, that looks cool. Maybe it's not cool, but something about this being a case where I have some amount of authority over the grades or some reason like this, that people will just sort of assent and somehow, like, it's weird to go, to what exactly counts as fully believing something. But let's say people are like, yeah, that's cool. But like in another context, most people would have said no, or it really isn't cool. That might be a case where the best explanation for everyone believing my jacket is cool is that this is a social situation where I've kind of put people on the spot in a weird way, and they haven't fully formed their beliefs in a reliable way. It's been more influenced by some social factor that we could probably spell out a little bit more. And if that's the best explanation for how everyone thinks my jacket is cool, then that seems to undermine the evidentiary value of everyone believing it. The other thing that could happen is people don't actually form a belief about it. They just immediately say yes, right? I don't want to be mean. This is awkward. I want to make this person happy, so they give me an A, right? Whatever the reason is, they don't actually think it's cool. They just say it's cool. Well, then it's not even consensus. It's like fake consensus. And that happens all the time, right? So think of Amazon reviews. How about the quality toaster case? Okay, I want a toaster oven, not just like a plain toaster, but like a toaster oven that actually makes good toast, but also, you can broil some stuff in it, make cookies, maybe large enough to make something a little bigger, like a pan of lasagna. I want a quality toaster oven. So I go on Amazon and I look at the reviews, and it looks like most people think brand X is the best toaster oven. Should I conclude that it is? Thus, now, one possibility is all those reviews are fake, or a lot of them are fake, especially the glowing ones or something like that. Or maybe, but basically, there isn't really consensus about this. It just looks like there is because somebody is putting fake reviews up or whatever. So that means one of our premises is actually false, which is different from assume it is true. Is it a legit piece of evidence for the conclusion? Like if it is true. So one is most people don't actually think those reviews are all fake. But let's say they're not fake. Let's say that most people really do think brand X is the best toaster oven as judged from their real reviews. These people bought the thing and then rated it, and this thing has the best ratings of anything else on Amazon. Does it follow that this is the best toaster oven? Is this a reason to think it is? Again, instead of immediately saying like our immediate like yes or no might be a guide to what we think the answer is, but then we should be able to stop and also give reasons for it. And Kelly's view is that we should be able to consider, well, why is there a consensus? What are the possible explanations for all the glowing reviews? One explanation is that the toaster oven is really good. It's the best one. And people are good at evaluating whether or not a toaster oven is good. Like when you put toast in it and it comes out just the right amount of crispy, people are good at judging that. You can just see it, right? That it's easy to clean, whatever quality you want in a toaster oven. It's the kind of thing that people are good judges of. It's not hard to see if a toaster oven sucks. That being said, people haven't had a chance to compare this one with other ones across a lot of dimensions. Very few people are like, I bought 3 toaster ovens and I carefully tested all of them and here's my review. And additionally, it's possible that maybe brand X was like the first to market. They spent a lot on advertising. Maybe there were initially fake reviews, so people bought it, and then it's a pretty good toaster oven. And so it kind of took off as the most highly reviewed ones, which sort of snowballed because then more people bought it just because it was reviewed, and then they gave good reviews. And there's actually a lot of really good, perhaps better quality, better priced toaster ovens on the market, but this one just has the best reviews overall. So that's another possible explanation. We have 2 plausible explanations. it really is the best toaster oven and people are good at evaluating their toaster ovens. And 2 is it's a fine toaster oven, but people are not equipped to compare it overall. And there's some reason to think that this one is the one most people bought and therefore evaluated, and that ultimately it's not really the best, and consensus isn't a great guide to this. But if you want one that definitely is fine, maybe it's good for that. Okay, so then we have to weigh it out. So you might again apply Kelly's view to the toaster oven case. Is the fact that there's consensus about which toaster oven is best evidence that indeed and this one there's a little more room to go with yes or no, or yeah, but it's not as clear cut, and there's more room to develop your reasoning about how the connect phase goes, right? So you've got a claim, you state Kelly's view, and then when you connect it, when you say how exactly this case connects to the view, where specifically the part you have to say is what's the best explanation for this consensus? How is it plausible that the consensus came about because this is the best toaster oven and people figured it out? What are the alternatives? It's that X, Y, and Z. There's more room for developing the possible explanations for the consensus, which is what you have to do. You have to identify them and you have to weigh them against each other in order to support your claim. All right, we'll end there.